The mountain air had never felt so bitter. Wind howled through the pines, like a ghost's lament, carrying flurries of snow that stung like needles against exposed skin. The dilapidated cabin, perched on the edge of Devil's Ridge, stood as a mockery of shelter, its weathered logs and sagging roof promising little comfort to the woman who now trudged the final steps of the overgrown path. Eleanor Caldwell had just inherited the most worthless piece of property in 3 counties, and the timing couldn't have been worse. The battered Ford pickup that had carried her the last 20 miles up the treacherous mountain road sat cooling. Behind her, loaded with whatever possessions she'd managed to salvage after the bank took her home. 6 months a widow, 3 months bankrupt, and now the reluctant owner of her great-uncle Morris's forgotten hunting cabin, a man she'd met exactly once, at her wedding 15 years ago. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. Eleanor paused at the cabin's warped wooden door, the rusted key trembling in her gloved hand. At 42, she'd never imagined starting over, especially not here, in this remote corner of Blackstone County, where cell service was as mythical as the tales of prosperity that had once drawn settlers to these unforgiving mountains. The December wind found every gap in her coat, a cruel reminder that winter had only just begun. The lock fought her at first, stubbornly resisting as if the cabin itself rejected her presence. Then with a reluctant groan, it gave way. The door swung inward, revealing darkness broken only by thin beams of grey light filtering through dirt-crusted windows. The musty smell of abandonment, of old paper, dust, and something vaguely animal rushed out to greet her. "Home, sweet home," she murmured, her voice sounding small in the emptiness. The cabin was larger inside than it had appeared from the road. A single room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a crude kitchen set up against another, and several pieces of furniture draped in yellowed sheets. A steep ladder led to what she assumed was a sleeping loft. The realtor's description had been generous in calling it rustic charm. Uninhabitable would have been more honest. Eleanor moved to the nearest window, wiping away years of grime with her sleeve. The view momentarily stole her breath, an endless expanse of pine-covered mountains rolling toward the horizon, peaks crowned with snow beneath a steel-gray sky. Beauty and desolation in equal measure. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled her from the moment. Through the cleared patch of glass, she watched a mud-spattered truck wind its way up the narrow road. It stopped beside her pickup, and a tall figure emerged, shoulders hunched against the cold. The stranger stood for a moment, surveying the cabin with what appeared to be dismay before starting up the path. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Her late husband Michael had always handled confrontation, his military background lending him a confidence she'd never possessed. But Michael was gone, buried beneath a simple stone that listed his rank and years of service, leaving her to face whatever came next, alone. The knock, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. Eleanor opened the door to find a man in his late 40s, his weathered face framed by dark hair threaded with silver. He wore a sheriff's department jacket, though no visible badge. His eyes, a striking shade of blue that seemed out of place in his rugged features, widened slightly at the sight of her. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "wasn't expecting anyone up here." "Apparently neither was this cabin," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the dismal interior behind her. A faint smile crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. "I'm Deputy Marshal James Harlan. Most folks just call me Harlan." Eleanor Caldwell, recognition flickered in his eyes. "Morris Whitaker's niece." "Great-niece," she corrected automatically. "You knew him." Everyone around here knew old Morris. Something in his tone suggested that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Word was he'd passed the property to family back east. "That you?" From Philadelphia, Yes, though not any more. The deputy glanced past her into the cabin, then back at her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to concern him. Mrs. Caldwell, I don't mean to pry, but you're not planning on staying here, are you? This place hasn't been properly inhabited for nearly 20 years. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. I don't have much choice, deputy, unless you're about to tell me Great-Uncle Morris had a secret mansion I didn't know about. No, ma'am. No. Mansion. His gaze traveled to her wedding ring, then to her eyes. You're alone? My husband passed away 6 months ago. Afghanistan. The words still burned her throat. Harlan removed his hat, a gesture of respect that seemed to belong to another era. I'm sorry for your loss. I served too. Different war, same hell. Before Eleanor could respond, a violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, rattling the windows and sending a shower of dust from the rafters. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. Storms coming in faster than expected, Harlan said, looking toward the darkening sky. This place isn't safe in its current condition. The roof won't hold against heavy snow, and the chimney's been blocked for years. There's a motel down in Colmont, about 40 minutes from here. I'd strongly suggest— I can't afford it, Eleanor cut in, the admission costing her more than he could know. I've got exactly $312 to my name, deputy. That needs to last until I can find work. Something shifted in Harlan's expression, not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of understanding. He glanced at his watch, then sighed. Give me an hour, he said finally. I've got some supplies in my truck. At the very least, we need to get this place warm and check the roof before that storm hits. Eleanor wanted to refuse his help, to prove she could manage on her own, but practicality won out over pride. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she had no idea how to prepare the cabin for a mountain winter. Thank you, she said simply. Harlan nodded once, then turned to head back to his vehicle. Eleanor watched him go, wondering what had brought a deputy marshal to this isolated spot in the first place. She'd assumed he was checking on the property, but something in his demeanor suggested otherwise. While Harlan retrieved supplies from his truck, Eleanor began exploring the cabin more thoroughly. She pulled the dusty sheets from the furniture, revealing a worn sofa, 2 mismatched armchairs, and a heavy oak dining table that looked solid enough to survive another century. A cast-iron stove stood in the kitchen area, alongside shelves stocked with ancient canned goods and preserves she wouldn't trust to feed a stray dog. The sleeping loft, accessed by the steep ladder, contained a narrow bedframe with a bare mattress that had mercifully been protected by a heavy tarp. A trunk sat at the foot of the bed, secured with a rusted padlock. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a stern-faced man standing beside a much younger Morris Whitaker, both holding rifles and standing over the carcass of a large buck. Back. Downstairs, Eleanor's attention was drawn to a bookshelf tucked into the corner beside the fireplace. Most of the volumes were practical guides, hunting manuals, plant identification, wilderness survival, but among them stood several leather-bound journals, their spines cracked with age. She had just reached for one when Harlan returned, arms loaded with firewood and a toolbox. Snow dusted his shoulders, evidence of the storm's arrival. Let's get that fireplace working first, he said, setting down his burden. Then I'll check the roof and chimney. For the next hour, they worked together in companionable silence. Harlan cleared the chimney of debris, while Eleanor swept decades of dust from the floor. He inspected the roof from inside and out, patching what he could and showing her where. Buckets would be needed when the rest inevitably leaked. Eleanor cleaned the windows, allowing precious light into the gloomy interior. By the time Harlan had a fire blazing in the hearth, the cabin had begun to transform from abandoned shell to potential shelter. It's not perfect, Harlan admitted, wiping soot from his hands, but it should keep you alive until spring if you're careful. The stove works for cooking, and there's a hand pump for water out back. You'll need to prime it regularly so it doesn't Freeze. I appreciate everything you've done, Eleanor said, the warmth from the fire beginning to reach her cold, numbed fingers. Harlan hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a handheld radio. Cell service is non-existent up here, but this will reach the station in Colemont. Keep it charged. There's a hand crank if the batteries die. Check in daily, especially during storms. Eleanor accepted the radio, surprised by his concern. Is it that dangerous up here? These mountains don't forgive mistakes, Mrs. Caldwell, especially in winter. He glanced around the cabin. You'll need more supplies, food, propane, proper bedding. I'll figure something out. She didn't mention her dwindling funds again. There must be work in Colemont. Harlan's expression suggested otherwise, but he didn't contradict her. Town's been struggling since the mine closed 10 years ago. Few businesses left, mostly serving the hunters during season, which just ended last month. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks against the screen. Outside, snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick flakes swirling past the windows. Harlan moved to the door, clearly preparing to leave, then paused. "Why here?" he asked abruptly. "There's nothing for you in these mountains." Eleanor considered, deflecting the question, but something in his direct gaze prompted honesty. "After Michael died, I tried to keep our house, our life, but his military pension barely covered the basics and the medical bills from his final illness." She shook her head. "The bank took everything last month. This cabin was the only option left. No family back east? None that would welcome. And me," the admission stung. Her relationship with her parents had deteriorated after she married Michael against their wishes, and his death hadn't mended those bridges. Harlan nodded, seeming to understand all she hadn't said. "There's a town meeting at the Colemont Community Center tomorrow evening. Come if you can make it down the mountain. People should know you're here." After he left, Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching his taillights disappear down the winding road until they were swallowed by the falling snow. The isolation settled around her like a physical presence, not entirely unwelcome after months of creditors' calls and pitying glances from former friends. She returned to the fire, warming her hands as the wind outside grew in intensity. The cabin creaked and groaned with each gust, but the old logs held firm. Despite its condition, there was something solid about the place, as if it had weathered far worse storms than this one. Eleanor's gaze returned to the bookshelf and the leather journals she'd noticed earlier. With the fire providing both light and warmth, she selected the oldest volume and settled into one of the armchairs. The journal's cover was worn smooth in places, the leather darkened by years of handling. No name or title marked its exterior. When she opened it, a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped out, landing on her lap. Eleanor set the journal aside and carefully unfolded the paper to reveal a hand-drawn map, the ink faded, but still legible. It showed what appeared to be a section of mountains, with a winding path marked from a point labeled Devil's Tooth to an area circled and marked simply X. A treasure map? Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity. Yet something about the careful detail, the precise measurements noted in the margins, suggested this was more than a child's game. She turned back to the journal, opening to the first page. The handwriting was bold and slanting, pressed deeply into the paper, as if the writer had been carving his words, rather than merely writing them. October 18th, 1899. Have acquired this journal from a dead man who no longer has use for recording. His thoughts, perhaps when my time comes, someone will make similar use of these pages. Until then, they shall serve as testament to the fact that Samuel Drake cannot be so easily disposed of, despite the best efforts of Judge Harmon and his pet lawman. 3 days since my escape from the territorial prison, and already tales of my demise spread through these mountains. Let them believe me, drowned in the Blackwater River. A ghost may move more freely than a hunted man. The wounds from their bullets heal slowly, but they will not be the death of me. I have found shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin high on Devil's Ridge, where even the most determined marshal would hesitate to venture as winter approaches. Here I shall recover my strength and plan what comes next. The gold remains where I left it, of this I am certain. None but I know of the mines, location, and those who assisted in its discovery are all dead, either by hangman's rope or my own hand. When spring arrives, I shall retrieve my fortune and disappear to Mexico, where a man with wealth may purchase the respect denied him here. Until then, I bide my time and watch for those who might still hunt the notorious Samuel Drake. Eleanor stared at the name, her heart suddenly racing. Samuel Drake, the notorious outlaw whose bloody exploits had terrorized the Western Territories at the turn of the century. Even she, with her Eastern upbringing, recognized the name from history, books and Western films. Drake had been responsible for a series of train robberies and bank heists across 3 states before mysteriously vanishing in 1900. Most historians believed he had died of his wounds while on the run. His body never recovered. But if this journal was authentic, Drake had survived and hidden in her great-uncle's cabin. More importantly, he had discovered a gold mine whose location had apparently died with him until now. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the map on her lap, then around the desolate cabin that had seemed like the final indignity in a series of losses. Could it be possible? Had her worthless inheritance just become priceless? The wind howled louder outside, rattling the windows in their frames as if the ghost of Samuel Drake himself was demanding she put down his journal. Instead, Eleanor turned the page, drawn deeper into the outlaw's account and the tantalizing promise of a fortune hidden somewhere in these unforgiving mountains. Eleanor read late into the night, the fire burning to embers as she devoured Samuel, Drake's account of his life as a fugitive. The journal entries spanned several months, from October 1899 to March 1900, detailing his recovery from gunshot wounds and his plans for the gold he'd allegedly discovered in these mountains. December 25, 1899, Christmas passes without celebration. The storm has raged for 3 days, burying the cabin in snow deep enough to reach the windowsills. My provisions dwindle faster than anticipated. The pain in my left side persists, the wound refusing to heal properly. Fever comes and goes. In my delirium, I see Judge Harmon's face, promising me the noose I so richly deserve, yet I cling to thoughts of the mine. The El Dorado vein, I've named it, after the city of gold that lured so many fools to their deaths. Unlike their fantasy, my gold is real. I've held it in my hands, watched it gleam in the lantern light deep within the mountain's heart. The local savages knew of it first. Red Hawk, the half-breed scout who betrayed his people to guide white men through these passes, spoke of a place the tribes avoided, a hollow mountain where the earth's blood turned solid. For 3 summers I searched, following fragments of stories, until Red Hawk himself revealed what he knew in exchange for whiskey and coin. He did not survive to spend either. These mountains keep secrets for those willing to pay the proper price. Eleanor shivered, though whether from the cold or Drake's callous words, she couldn't tell. The outlaw's journal painted a disturbing picture of a man without conscience, whose greed and ruthlessness had left a trail of bodies across the frontier. Yet she couldn't stop reading, drawn by the detailed descriptions of the gold mine's location, clues that could potentially change her desperate circumstances. According to Drake, the mine entrance was hidden in a box canyon northeast of what he called Devil's Tooth, a distinctive rock formation. His rough map showed landmarks that might still exist, though modern names could differ from those he used. Eleanor finally closed the journal well past midnight, her mind racing with possibilities. If Drake's account was true, if the gold mine existed and remained undiscovered all these years, she could rebuild her life beyond anything she'd imagined. The crushing debt that had followed Michael's death could be erased. The constant struggle to survive could end, yet doubt crept in with the mountain cold. Why had no one found the mine in over a century? Had great-uncle Morris known about Drake's journal? If so, why hadn't he searched for the gold himself? Perhaps he had, and found nothing but an outlaw's delusions. Sleep came fitfully, the narrow bed in the loft, offering little comfort. The storm intensified overnight, wind shrieking through every crack in the cabin's walls. By morning, the world outside had transformed into a blinding white expanse, the snow nearly 3 feet deep and still falling. Eleanor descended the ladder stiffly, her body protesting the previous day's exertions and the night's poor sleep. The fire had died completely, leaving the cabin frigid. Her breath clouded before her as she fumbled with matches and kindling, grateful for Harlan's lessons the day before. As flames gradually consumed the wood, casting flickering shadows across the walls, Eleanor's gaze returned to the bookshelf. 5 more journals stood beside the gap where she'd removed Drake's account. Had the outlaw continued his story, or were these her great-uncle's records? With the fire establishing a small circle of warmth, Eleanor retrieved the remaining volumes. The second proved to be a continuation of Drake's journal, beginning in April 1900 after an apparent gap in his writing. April 3rd, 1900 winter's grip finally weakens. The snow recedes enough to permit travel down to the settlement they call Coalmont. Though I dare not show my face openly, 3 nights ago I ventured out disguised as a simple prospector, my beard grown long enough to change my appearance sufficiently. News travels slowly to these remote parts, but my name remains known. In the saloon, men still speak of the Drake, the gang's final robbery, though they believe me long dead. A new theory circulates that I escaped with the Union Pacific gold and fled to Canada or perhaps Europe, living as a gentleman on my ill-gotten fortune. If only they knew how close the notorious Samuel Drake stood, nursing cheap whiskey while they spun their tales. If only they knew that the fortune they imagine me spending exists not in some foreign bank, but buried in the heart of their own mountains, waiting for spring to fully reveal its entrance once more. The lawman who pursues me most doggedly, Marshal Robert Harmon, the judge's own son, was reportedly seen in Denver last month. The distance brings some comfort, yet I know he will never abandon the hunt. The vendetta is too personal. His brother James died in the Clearwater Bank heist, shot. By my own hand when he foolishly attempted heroics. Blood demands blood, as the savages say. But Harmon will find only a ghost if he ventures into these mountains after me. Eleanor paused at the mention of the name Harmon. Was there a connection to Deputy Marshal Harlan? The coincidence seemed too great, especially given his unexplained presence at the cabin yesterday. She returned to the journal, more convinced than ever that these entries contained more than an outlaw's ramblings. The April and May entries detailed Drake's preparations for recovering his gold. He described repairing mining tools, fashioning torches, and studying the movements of the few locals who ventured near the ridge. By June, he claimed to have returned to the mine several times, extracting enough gold to fill 2 good-sized saddlebags, more wealth than most men see in a lifetime. Then came the entry that made Eleanor's heart race. June 18th, 1900 disaster. I was spotted near the mine entrance by a hunting party. Though I fled before they could identify me, they surely saw a man where no man should be. I dare not return to the El Dorado for some time, perhaps until the first snow drives the curious from these heights. The gold, already extracted, must be secured. The cabin serves well enough for my own shelter, but holds too many potential hiding places to truly secure such treasure. Instead, I have concealed the saddlebags beneath the great stone that stands like a sentinel at the northern corner of the property, where the oak and 3 pines meet to form a natural marker visible even in darkness. There, 4 feet down, my fortune waits. Should circumstances force me to flee these mountains before I can retrieve it, this record shall serve as my memory when it becomes safe to return. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reread the passage. Drake had hidden gold, not in some inaccessible mine, but here on the property, possibly just yards from where she now sat, the northern corner where an oak and 3 pines met. Did that landmark still exist after 125 years? She moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass to peer out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had finally slackened, though thick flakes still swirled down from a pewter sky. Through the white haze, she could make out the shapes of evergreens bordering the property, but she couldn't identify specific trees, let alone find a distinctive grouping without venturing outside. Eleanor reached for her coat, then hesitated. Harlan had warned her about the dangers of the mountain winter. Venturing out alone in these conditions, with no clear landmarks and snow deep enough to hide potential hazards, would be foolish, possibly fatal. The gold, if it existed, had remained, hidden for over a century. It could wait another day. Instead, she returned to the journals, hoping for more specific information about the mine's location or additional hiding places. The next volume, however, wasn't Drake's. The handwriting was different, less aggressive, more measured, and the first entry was dated October 1926, more than 25 years after Drake's last entry. October 12, 1926, I have acquired this hunting cabin and surrounding acreage from the Jenkins estate for a quite reasonable sum. The isolation suits my purposes, and the local tales of hauntings have kept the property value appealingly low. Whether the ghost of Samuel Drake truly walks these ridges matters little to me. I seek not spirits, but the more tangible legacy the outlaw may have left behind. Sheriff Collins dismisses the Drake legend as campfire stories embellished over decades, yet historical record confirms the Union Pacific robbery occurred exactly as locals describe. Over $20,000 in gold coins disappeared that day. A fortune never recovered, despite the capture or death of every gang member save Drake himself. The prevailing theory that Drake escaped with the gold does not account for his wounded state, nor the unforgiving terrain he fled into. Logic suggests he concealed the stolen gold somewhere in these mountains, intending to retrieve it once pursuit had ended. Instead, most believe he perished from his wounds, taking the secret of the gold's location to his grave. Unless, of course, he recorded that secret elsewhere, in a journal perhaps, kept in the very cabin where he sought refuge during that final winter. Eleanor stared at the page. This must be her great-uncle Morris's journal, revealing that he had purchased the cabin specifically because of the Drake legend. He had been searching for the same gold she now knew about, but had he found it? She read on, following Morris. Whitaker's methodical account of his search through the cabin, his exploration of the surrounding woods, his interviews with elderly locals who remembered stories about the notorious outlaw. Month after month, Morris documented his failure to locate either Drake's final resting place or the stolen gold. By 1928, his entries grew increasingly bitter and sporadic. May 30th, 1928, another season, another failure. I have exhausted all reasonable possibilities. The cabin has yielded nothing despite removing floorboards and examining every inch of the walls and chimney. The surrounding forests have been searched in ever-widening circles. I have followed every rumor, every supposed sighting of Drake in his final days. Perhaps the gold never existed. Perhaps Drake died with empty pockets, and his legend grew simply Because humans crave mysteries, or perhaps I have been looking in entirely the wrong location, misled by conflicting accounts and my own desperate desire to believe. I shall remain for the summer hunting season, then return to Pittsburgh for the winter. The cabin will stand empty until spring, or until some other fool convinces himself he can succeed where I have failed. Eleanor flipped through the remaining pages, but Morris had apparently abandoned his journal after 1928, though additional blank pages remained. She set it aside and picked up the next volume, finding it contained sporadic entries spanning from 1930 to 1955, documenting Morris's increasingly infrequent visits to the cabin. The final entries revealed he had never found Drake's gold, though he maintained ownership of the property until his death. The last journal belonged not to Morris, but to a man named Thomas Whitaker, presumably Morris's son or nephew, who had inherited the cabin in 1972, but visited only once, according to the single entry. July 15th, 1972, Uncle Morris's hunting cabin is exactly as depressing as Father described. I can scarcely believe the old man wasted decades of his life chasing outlaw gold in this godforsaken wilderness. The property taxes barely justify maintaining ownership, yet sentiment prevents me from selling. Perhaps someday my own children will find use for this place, though I sincerely doubt it. I've arranged for Jeb Harlan to keep an eye on the property. His family has served as unofficial caretakers since Morris first purchased the land. The arrangement seems to satisfy him, particularly since I've granted hunting and timber rights in exchange for his services. The cabin will remain locked but maintained, a monument to one man's futile obsession. Eleanor closed the final journal, her mind whirling with connections. Harlan. The name appeared throughout the journals, first as Marshal Robert Harmon, who had pursued Drake, then as the Harlan family, who watched over the property for generations. Could Deputy Marshal James Harlan be descended from Drake's pursuer? Had his family maintained its connection to the cabin all these years because they too suspected the gold remained hidden somewhere on the property? The coincidence seemed too great. Had Harlan appeared yesterday out of neighborly concern, or had he been checking on the cabin regularly, perhaps continuing his family's own search? His surprise at finding her there suddenly made more sense. Eleanor moved to the window again. The snow had finally stopped, leaving a pristine white blanket covering everything in sight. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of civilization that had been the backdrop to her entire life. Just vast, empty wilderness stretching in every direction. In that silence, the radio Harlan had given her crackled to life, making her jump. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is Deputy Harlan. Do you copy? Over." Eleanor fumbled with the device, trying to remember how he'd shown her to operate it. "I'm here," she said, pressing what she hoped was the right button. "Over. Glad to hear your voice." Relief was evident in his tone. "Storm knocked out power to half the county. Road to Devil's Ridge is impassable. Until the plows get through, likely tomorrow at earliest. You've got heat, food, over." Eleanor glanced at the fireplace, now burning steadily, and the few canned goods she'd brought with her. "Enough for now. The cabin held up well. Over. Good to hear." There was a brief pause. "Listen, when I was up there yesterday, I didn't get a chance to ask. Did you find anything unusual in the cabin? Anything Morris might have left behind?" Over. The question confirmed her suspicions. Harlan knew about Drake's connection to the cabin, possibly about the gold as well. But how much did he know? Had he found the journals already, read them, and was now simply checking if she had discovered them too? "Just some old furniture and books," she replied carefully. "Nothing valuable. Why do you ask?" Over. Another pause, longer this time. "No reason in particular. Old Morris had a reputation for collecting historical items related to the area. Thought he might have left something interesting. Listen, I've got to coordinate some emergency responses down here. Check in again tomorrow. Same time? Over. Will do. Thank you again for your help yesterday. Over. The radio fell silent, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the knowledge that Deputy Harlan had not been entirely forthcoming about his interest in the cabin. Neither had she, of course. The journals and the potential fortune they described would remain her secret for now. Eleanor moved to the cabin door and opened it, gasping as frigid air rushed in. The snow stretched unbroken across the clearing, waist-deep in places. Beyond the trees at the property's edge, she could make out a formation that might be the great stone Drake had mentioned. And yes, there stood an oak tree, massive and ancient, flanked by what appeared to be 3 evergreens, the northern corner where Drake claimed to have buried gold worth a fortune. Eleanor closed the door, her mind calculating possibilities. The ground would be frozen solid now, impossible to dig without proper equipment. Even if she could reach the spot, excavation would have to wait for spring thaws. But if Harlan suspected the gold's existence, she might not have until spring. Before others came looking, the journals were her only advantage, her only proof of ownership if the gold was found. She needed to secure them somewhere safe, study them more carefully, and prepare for the possibility that others might challenge her claim to whatever treasure lay beneath the snow. For the first time since Michael's death, Eleanor felt something beyond grief and desperation. Purpose flooded through her, along with a fierce determination that would have surprised those who knew only her former life as a banker's quiet, accommodating wife. Eleanor Caldwell had come to these mountains with nothing left to lose. Now, against all odds, she had found something worth fighting for. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day reinforcing the cabin against the cold, trying to distract herself from thoughts of buried gold and the questions Deputy Harlan's radio call had raised. She found a supply of split wood stacked against the back wall, partially covered by a tarp and mercifully dry enough to burn. The hand pump behind the cabin required 20 minutes of vigorous effort before it sputtered to life, producing icy water that numbed her fingers within seconds. Inside, she took inventory of her meager supplies, 3 days' worth of canned food she'd brought from Philadelphia, a half-empty bag of coffee, some protein bars and beef jerky from the gas station, where she'd stopped on the drive up. She would need to get to Colmont soon, regardless of her plans for Drake's gold, as twilight descended on the mountain, turning the snow-covered landscape into a terrain of blue shadows. Eleanor returned to Drake's journals. She read more carefully, now noting every geographical reference, every description of landmarks that might help locate the mine entrance. The Outlaw had been deliberately vague in places, paranoid that his writings might fall into the wrong hands, but certain details remained consistent. The mine entrance lay in a box canyon northeast of Devil's Tooth. It was marked by 3 standing stones arranged like a gateway, and accessible only via a narrow path that was treacherous in the best weather, potentially fatal otherwise. Drake mentioned a waterfall that froze in winter, creating a curtain of ice behind which the mountain reveals its treasures. Eleanor searched the cabin for maps, finding nothing more recent than a faded 1950s Forestry Service chart tucked into the final journal. It showed the major peaks and valleys of the region, including one labeled Devil's Tooth Ridge, now apparently renamed Blackstone Ridge on modern maps. If the landmark remained, perhaps she could locate it come spring. The hour grew late, but sleep eluded her. The wind picked up again outside, not the full force of the previous storm, but enough to send eerie whistling sounds through the cabin's many drafts. In the wavering firelight, shadows danced across the walls as if the cabin's previous occupants were performing a silent, spectral ballet for her benefit. The isolation pressed in around her. Back in Philadelphia, she had never known such absolute solitude. Even in grief, she had been surrounded by people. Well-meaning friends, neighbors, Michael's former colleagues. Here she was utterly alone, with only the thoughts in her head and the ghosts of the past for company. A sudden crack outside startled her from her thoughts. She froze, listening intently. It came again, the unmistakable sound of breaking branches, as if something large was moving through the trees near the cabin. Eleanor reached for the radio, then hesitated. What would she say? That she was frightened by noises in the woods. Harlan would think her a foolish city woman, jumping at the natural sounds of the forest. Besides, he'd mentioned coordinating emergency responses in Colmont. The storm had likely caused significant damage in the town. He had more pressing concerns than her imagined terrors. Another crack, closer this time. Then silence. Eleanor moved cautiously to the nearest window, wiping away condensation to peer into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting enough light to turn the snow-covered clearing into a pale blue stage. At first, she saw nothing but unbroken white and the dark silhouettes of trees. Then movement caught her eye. A massive form emerged from the tree line, a bull elk, its impressive antlers creating a crown of shadows against the snow. It moved with surprising grace despite its size, leaving a trail of deep impressions as it crossed the clearing. The animal paused halfway, raising its head as if sensing her watching, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. For a long moment, they regarded each other, woman and wilderness incarnate, separated by glass and mutual wariness. Then the elk continued on its path, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing as silently as it had appeared. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter left her feeling both humbled and reassured. Life continued here, had continued for centuries before humans built cabins and chased gold, would continue long after. The perspective steadied her, reminded her that her problems, while significant to her, were fleeting against the backdrop of these ancient mountains. She returned to the fire, adding another log before settling back with Drake's first journal. This time, she read not for information about the gold, but to understand the man whose ghostly presence seemed to permeate the cabin's very walls. November 6th, 1899. First snow fell today. The cabin grows colder despite my efforts to seal drafts. With strips of blanket, the wound in my side continues to seep, though the infection seems to have abated. I am no stranger to pain, having carried bullets in my flesh on 3 previous occasions, but never have I been so isolated during recovery. I find myself thinking of my childhood in Missouri before the war changed everything. My father did not return from Shiloh, and mother withered like an unwatered plant in his absence. By 14 I was alone and hungry, easy prey for men like Barton, who recognized my desperation and offered brotherhood along with bread. What might Samuel Drake have become in another life? A farmer like my father? A shopkeeper? A lawman? The thought is laughable now, with 6 men's deaths attributed directly to my hand and more that went unrecorded. Yet in these long hours of solitude, such questions surface like unwelcome visitors. The pain grows worse at night. I've rationed the laudanum carefully, but even so, the bottle will empty before the new year arrives. Then there will be only whiskey and willpower between me and the consequences of my choices. The entry revealed a side of Drake she hadn't expected. Not remorse exactly, but a moment of reflection, of humanity in a man history remembered only for his violence. The pages that followed detailed his slow recovery, his careful monitoring of supplies, and his growing obsession with returning to the gold mine when spring allowed. December 31st, 1899. The century ends tonight. I mark its passing alone, with only The howling wind for company, and the last of my whiskey for comfort. In the new century, Samuel Drake will cease to exist. The gold will provide a new name, a new life, far from these territories. Perhaps Mexico, perhaps further south. I hear Argentina welcomes men of means without asking too many questions about their origins. The fever returned yesterday, bringing strange dreams. I saw Judge Harmon's face, then his son's, both promising retribution. I saw Red Hawk, the bullet hole in his forehead leaking not blood but liquid gold. I saw the El Dorado vein stretching endless through the mountain, pulsing like a living artery. When I woke, a man stood at the foot of my bed, translucent as morning mist, features indistinct, save for eyes that burned like embers. He spoke no words, yet I understood his message clearly. The gold exacts its price from all who seek it. Delirium, surely, yet the vision lingers even in waking. I am not a superstitious man. I have killed without hesitation when necessary, have taken what I needed from those who stood in my path. Yet something about this place, these mountains, suggests a reckoning beyond human justice. The natives avoided the mine for reasons beyond simple fear or superstition. Red Hawk spoke of it as cursed ground before I silenced him. Perhaps in the new century I shall heed such warnings more carefully. Or perhaps the fever simply loosens my grip on reason. Either way, the gold remains my only path forward. Whatever price it demands, I shall pay willingly. Eleanor closed the journal, disturbed by Drake's fever dream and the mention of a curse. She didn't believe in such things, of course. Rational thought had been her companion through the worst days of her life. But alone in this isolated cabin, with the wind moaning through the trees outside, it was difficult to dismiss the outlaw's words entirely. She placed the journals back on the shelf, keeping only the rough map Drake had drawn. Tomorrow, she would go through the cabin more systematically, searching for any clues her great-uncle might have overlooked during his decades-long hunt for the outlaw's gold. For tonight, she needed rest if she was to face whatever challenges the mountain presented next. The sleeping loft was marginally warmer than the main room, heat from the fire below rising through the floorboards. Eleanor wrapped herself in every layer of clothing she'd brought, plus a musty blanket she'd found in a trunk and vigorously shaken outside. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cabin's unfamiliar sounds and dreams of labyrinthine mine shafts where shadows always remained just beyond the reach of her flashlight. She woke to grey dawn and the soft patter of melting snow dripping from the eaves. The temperature had risen overnight, bringing a temporary thaw that would turn the mountain roads into treacherous mud before inevitably refreezing. If she wanted to reach Colmont for supplies, today might offer her only window of opportunity. After a breakfast of instant coffee and a protein bar, Eleanor layered up and ventured outside. The snow had compacted slightly, making movement easier than she'd anticipated. She trudged around the perimeter of the cabin, assessing the property in daylight. The clearing extended roughly 100 yards in each direction before the forest reclaimed the land. To the east, the ground sloped upward toward higher peaks. To the west, it fell away sharply, offering breathtaking views of the valley below and distant mountains beyond. Directly north, where Drake had allegedly buried his saddlebags of gold, stood the formation she'd glimpsed yesterday, a massive oak tree flanked by 3 tall pines. Eleanor approached slowly, her boots crunching through the snow's icy crust. The oak was enormous, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. The pines stood in a neat row beside it, creating a natural boundary marker, exactly as Drake had described. At the convergence of these trees lay a large, flat boulder, the great stone from the journal. Her heart raced. Could it really be this simple? Had her great-uncle Morris somehow missed the most obvious hiding place? On the property, the ground around the boulder was frozen solid, covered in at least 2 feet of snow. Even if she had proper tools, excavation would be impossible until spring. Still, the confirmation that Drake's landmark existed exactly as described sent a surge of hope through her. Perhaps the rest of his account was equally accurate. Eleanor made a complete circuit of the property, noting other features that matched descriptions from the journals. A stream to the east, now frozen solid. A distinctive outcropping of rock that resembled a crouching bear. The remains of what might have been an old trapper's lean-to, long collapsed under the weight of countless winters. By the time she returned to the cabin, the sun had risen higher, accelerating the snowmelt. Water dripped steadily from the roof, and the path she'd created with her footprints was already turning muddy. If she intended to drive down to Colmont, she needed to do so quickly before the roads deteriorated further. Eleanor packed a small bag with Drake's journals. She wouldn't risk leaving them unattended in the cabin, and prepared for the journey. The Ford pickup started reluctantly after several attempts, its aging engine protesting the cold. The dirt road leading down from Devil's Ridge was treacherous, partially melted snow creating slick patches that sent the truck's rear end fishtailing, dangerously around corners. Eleanor drove with white-knuckled concentration, her city driving experiences poor preparation for mountain conditions. An hour later, the road widened and improved as it joined the main route into Colmont. The town appeared suddenly around a bend, a small collection of buildings nestled in a valley, many showing damage from the recent storm. Broken windows had been hastily covered with plywood. Downed power lines lay draped across yards like discarded streamers. A large tree had collapsed onto the roof of what appeared to be the town's only church. Eleanor parked outside the general store, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign proclaiming Morley's Mercantile, serving Colmont since 1923. A bell jingled as she entered, announcing her arrival to the half-dozen customers inside. Conversation stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned to assess the stranger in their midst. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man with grey hair and suspenders nodded in greeting. "Morning," he said cautiously. "Help you find something?" "I need supplies," Eleanor replied, aware of the continuing stares. Food, batteries, candles, anything suitable for an extended stay up on Devil's Ridge. Murmurs rippled through the store at her words. The man, presumably Morley himself, raised his eyebrows. "Devil's Ridge? You staying at the old Whitaker place?" When Eleanor nodded, he whistled low. "Ain't been nobody living up there in decades. Thought the property was abandoned for good." "It belonged to my great-uncle," Eleanor explained. "I inherited it recently." "You're Morris Whitaker's kin." An elderly woman stepped forward, her rheumy eyes examining Eleanor with newfound interest. "Well, I'll be. You look nothing like him, thank the Lord. Ornery old coot had a face that could curdle milk." Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the blunt assessment. "You knew my great-uncle?" Everybody in Colmont knew Morris. The woman extended a gnarled hand. "Ida Wilkins. My late husband Frank used to guide your uncle on hunting trips up in those mountains. Or so Morris claimed. He never brought back much game, always more interested in old tales and landmarks than actual hunting." The confirmation of Morris's true interests sent a small thrill through Eleanor. What kind of tales was he interested in? Ida glanced around the store where other customers were now openly listening to their conversation. "Tales better discussed over a proper cup of coffee," she said meaningfully. "Why don't you gather your supplies, then join me at the diner across the street? I dare say you could use a hot meal that didn't come from a can." The offer was too tempting to refuse. Eleanor quickly selected essentials: canned goods, rice, beans, matches, batteries, a solar-powered lantern, and, at Morley's insistence, a snow shovel and bag of ice melt. The total came to more than she'd hoped to spend. leaving her with less than $200 to her name, but survival necessitated the expense. After loading the supplies into her truck, Eleanor crossed the slushy street to the Colmont Diner, a tiny establishment with a flickering open sign in the window. Inside, red vinyl booths lined one wall, while a counter with chrome stools occupied the other. The place was nearly empty, the lunch rush apparently not yet begun. Ida Wilkins beckoned from a corner booth. A steaming mug of coffee already waited. "It's Eleanor's place. Figured you'd need warming up," the older woman said as Eleanor slid into the booth. "Sarah," she called to the waitress, "bring my friend here the special, on my tab." "You don't need to," Eleanor began, but Ida waved away. Her protest, "Don't get many new faces around here, especially not in winter. Humor an old woman's curiosity." She sipped her own coffee, sizing Eleanor up over the rim of her mug. "Now what brings Morris Whitaker's great-niece to claim a broken-down cabin in the dead of winter? Must be something mighty important to risk these mountains this time of year." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Financial difficulties," she said finally. "I recently lost my husband, and subsequently our home. The cabin was my only option." Ida's weathered face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, dear. These mountains can be harsh, but they can also heal a broken heart, given time." She leaned forward slightly. "But that doesn't explain your interest in the stories Morris chased. I saw it in your eyes the moment I mentioned them." Before Eleanor could respond, the diner's door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and Deputy Marshal James Harlan. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Eleanor with an expression of mingled surprise and concern. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, approaching their booth. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon. Roads must be better than I thought." "Deputy," Eleanor acknowledged, fighting the urge to touch her bag where Drake's journals resided. "The thaw made it possible, though I suspect they'll be impassable again by nightfall." Ida chuckled. "James Harlan, still playing the concerned lawman after all these years. Sit down, boy, and stop looming over us like the tax collector." To Eleanor's surprise, Harlan complied, sliding into the booth beside Ida. "Mrs. Wilkins was just filling me in on some local history," Eleanor explained, "about my great-uncle Morris." Something flickered in Harlan's eyes, caution, perhaps, or concern. "Morris Whitaker was an interesting character," he said carefully. "My grandfather used to tell stories about his obsession with the Drake legend." "Legend?" Eleanor kept her voice deliberately casual. "Samuel Drake," Ida supplied. "The outlaw who supposedly hid out in these mountains after the Union Pacific robbery. Your uncle was convinced Drake had stashed the stolen gold somewhere near his cabin. Most locals think it's just a story," Harlan added, watching Eleanor's reaction closely. "No concrete evidence Drake ever came to these parts, let alone hid gold here." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "And what do you think, Deputy?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Before Harlan could respond, the waitress arrived with Eleanor's food, a generous plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans that sent a wave of hunger through her. She hadn't realized how famished she was until the aroma hit her. "I think," Harlan said as the waitress departed, "that these mountains hold plenty of secrets, some worth finding, others better left buried." He glanced at his watch. "Speaking of which, the town meeting's been moved up to 4 o'clock due to weather concerns. If you're interested in meeting your neighbors, Mrs. Caldwell, that would be the time." "I'll consider it," Eleanor replied, though in truth she had no intention of missing the meeting. Any gathering of locals might provide valuable information about the mountains, the history of Drake's activities in the area, or insight into why her great-uncle had failed to locate the gold despite decades of searching. Harlan nodded and rose from the booth. "Mrs. Wilkins, Mrs. Caldwell," he said with a slight tip of his hat, "enjoy your meal." He departed, the bell above the door jingling in his wake. Ida watched him go with narrowed eyes. The Harlans have been keeping an eye on that cabin since before James was born, she said once he was out of earshot. His grandfather Jeb had some arrangement with Morris. After Jeb passed, James's father took over. Now James himself. 3 generations tied to that piece of property they don't even own. Eleanor paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. You think they're looking for the gold too? The older woman shrugged. Wouldn't surprise me. The Harlan family's got history with Samuel Drake, bad blood. What kind of history? What kind of... James's great-grandfather was a lawman, a federal marshal named Robert Harmon. Story goes, he pursued Drake for years after the Union Pacific robbery, made it his personal mission to bring the outlaw to justice. Harmon, not Harlan, Eleanor asked, recalling the journal's mention of Marshal Robert Harmon. Family changed the name sometime in the 1920s. Never knew why. Ida leaned closer, lowering her voice. But here's what's interesting. Robert Harmon's brother was supposedly killed during one of Drake's bank robberies. The marshal's pursuit wasn't just professional duty, it was a vendetta. The information aligned perfectly with Drake's journal. Entries? Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Did they ever find Drake? Or the gold? Neither, far as anyone knows. Drake vanished into these mountains in the winter of 1899. Come spring, when the snow melted, search parties found no trace of him. Most figured he died out there, his body claimed by the wilderness or wild animals. But you don't believe that, Eleanor guessed, noting the skepticism in Ida's tone. The older woman smiled, revealing surprising dimples in her wrinkled cheeks. What I believe is that men like Samuel Drake don't die easily, and gold doesn't just disappear. She tapped a gnarled finger against the tabletop. Your great-uncle spent 30 years searching these mountains, right up until his health failed. Morris wasn't a fool, despite what some folks thought. If he devoted that much time to the hunt, he had reason to believe there was something to find. Eleanor hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since discovering the journals. Why would Drake hide the gold and then leave it behind? If he survived his wounds, wouldn't he have retrieved it and disappeared? That's the mystery that kept Morris looking, Ida replied. Some say Drake died before he could return for it. Others think he did recover the gold, but was killed while trying to leave the territory. The most interesting theory, though, she glanced around the nearly empty diner, then continued in a near whisper. Some believe Drake never left at all. You mean he stayed in the area? Wouldn't someone have recognized him? Not if he changed. His identity. In those days, a man could reinvent himself easily, especially in remote places like this. No photographs on every street corner, no instant communication between towns. Ida's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a born storyteller. Reaching her tale's climax, some old-timers used to whisper that Drake became someone else entirely. A respectable citizen who lived out his days in plain sight, his past crimes unknown to his new neighbors. The theory sent Eleanor's mind racing. If true, it might explain why the gold had never been recovered. Perhaps Drake had established a new life that made retrieving the stolen money too risky. Or maybe he'd hidden the gold so effectively that even he couldn't locate it again when he finally felt safe enough to try. She finished her meal while Ida shared more local history. The boom and bust of the coal mines that had given Colmont its name. The harsh winters that occasionally isolated the town completely. The gradual exodus of younger residents seeking opportunities in larger cities. Throughout the conversation, Eleanor was acutely aware of the journals in her bag, their explosive contents potentially upending generations of speculation. I should head back before the roads worsen, she said finally, thanking Ida for the meal. But I'd like to hear more of your stories sometime. You've lived here a long time. You might recognize landmarks or places Drake mentioned. Ida's eyes twinkled. "So you did find something in that cabin," she said. "I wondered when you'd admit." "It," Eleanor startled. "I didn't say didn't have to, dear. Your face gives you away. Whatever you found, you'd best be careful who you share it with." The older woman's expression grew serious. "Gold makes good people do terrible things, always has." With that warning echoing in her mind, Eleanor left the diner and crossed to the community center, a modest building with a recently replaced roof and fresh paint that marked it as one of the town's better-maintained structures. Though the meeting wasn't scheduled to start for another hour, several people were already gathering inside, shedding heavy coats and stomping snow from boots. Eleanor found a seat near the back, grateful for the building's warmth after the frigid walk from the diner. She observed the townspeople as they filed in, mostly older residents, with a scattering of middle-aged faces and precious few under 30. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of those who had shared both hardships and celebrations over many years, occasionally glancing curiously in her direction, but maintaining a respectful distance. At precisely 4 o'clock, Mayor Howard Collins called the meeting to order. A portly man with a fringe of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he projected an air of affable competence as he addressed the room. "Folks, as you can see, we've got quite a mess to clean up after. That storm," he began. "Power's still out in the north end of town, and the road to Emmett's Creek is completely washed out. Earl's team is working on it, but we're looking at least a week before it's passable again." The mayor continued outlining the storm damage and recovery efforts. Eleanor listened with half an ear, more interested in studying the community dynamics. She noted who nodded in agreement with the mayor's assessments, who frowned in disagreement, who whispered comments to their neighbors. Understanding the town's power structure might prove valuable if questions arose about her claim to Drake's gold. "On a brighter note," the mayor continued, "I'd like to welcome a newcomer to our community. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell has taken up residence in the old Whitaker cabin on Devil's Ridge. She's Morris Whitaker's great-niece, come all the way from Philadelphia." All eyes turned toward Eleanor, who forced a smile and a small wave. The scrutiny was uncomfortable, but not unexpected. In small towns like Colmont, newcomers were both curiosities and potential resources. Fresh blood in an aging community, yet unknowns with unproven loyalties. "Mrs. Caldwell," the mayor called, "would you like to introduce yourself?" Eleanor hesitated, then stood. "Thank you, Mayor Collins. As you said, I'm Morris Whitaker's great-niece. I inherited the cabin after his estate was finally settled." No need to mention that she'd been the last option, the distant relative no one else had bothered to contact until all more desirable heirs had declined the remote property. "I'm planning to stay through the winter at least, possibly longer if things work out here." "Mighty brave to tackle Devil's Ridge in winter with no experience," called a voice from the crowd, a lean, weathered man in his 60s, "especially in that old cabin. Roof's been needing replacement for a decade." "I'm learning quickly," Eleanor replied with more confidence than she felt, "and I'm grateful for Deputy Harlan's assistance during the storm." At the mention of Harlan, she scanned the room for him, spotting him near the door in conversation with a younger deputy. He glanced up at his name, meeting her eyes briefly before returning to his discussion. "Well, we're glad to have you, Mayor," Collins said. "Colmont can always use new residents. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We look after our own here." The sentiment seemed genuine, though Eleanor wondered how quickly their own might become outsider if word spread about the gold possibly hidden on her property. For now, though, the welcome felt sincere, and she appreciated the gesture. The meeting continued with discussions of upcoming holiday events, requests for volunteers to help elderly residents with storm repairs, and a heated debate about whether to postpone the annual Christmas pageant due to damage to the church roof. Throughout it all, Eleanor observed, absorbing the dynamics of her new community while keeping the journal's secrets close. As the meeting concluded, several people approached to introduce themselves. A retired teacher offered books from her personal library. The general store owner promised to deliver supplies if the roads became impassable again. A young mother with 2 small children in tow invited Eleanor to Christmas dinner. The kindness was unexpected after months of dealing with creditors and fair-weather friends back in Philadelphia. Mrs. Caldwell. Eleanor turned to find Deputy Harlan beside her, his expression unreadable. "You made quite an impression," he said, nodding toward the departing townsfolk. "Colmont doesn't usually warm up to newcomers this quickly." "I guess being Morris Whitaker's relative counts for something," she replied. "That, and people respect. Anyone willing to brave Devil's Ridge in December?" His gaze sharpened. "Speaking of which, I'd be happy to drive you back up. Roads are already starting to ice over again." The offer seemed innocent enough, but Eleanor sensed an underlying motive. Did Harlan want to search the cabin more thoroughly? Or was he simply fulfilling his duty as local law enforcement, ensuring her safety? "Thank you, but I can manage," she said. "I have chains for the tires if needed." Disappointment, or was it relief, flickered across his features. "Fair enough. But take this." He handed her a business card with his personal cell. Number scrawled on the back. "Reception's spotty up there, but it sometimes works from the ridge's western edge if you need emergency assistance." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Eleanor was struck by the roughness of his hands. Working hands, not unlike her husband's had been. Michael, too, had borne calluses from years of practical labor before his military service, a stark contrast to the soft-handed bankers and lawyers she'd socialized with during their marriage. "Thank you, Deputy. James," he corrected. "Everyone here uses first names except during official business. James," she repeated, "and I'm Eleanor." Something shifted in his expression. A softening around the eyes, perhaps. "Well, Eleanor, the offer stands if you change your mind. These mountains get dangerous fast when the weather turns." As if to emphasize his point, the community center's doors burst open, admitting a blast of frigid air and the alarming news that temperatures were plummeting rapidly, turning the day's meltwater into treacherous black ice. Several attendees immediately altered their plans, arranging to stay with friends in town rather than risk the mountain roads. Eleanor wavered, reconsidering Harlan's offer. Her worn pickup had already struggled with the descent that morning. The ascent in worsening conditions would be even more challenging. Yet the journals in her bag demanded privacy for further study. She couldn't risk Harlan discovering them if he drove her home. "I appreciate your concern," she told him, "but I really should leave now before conditions worsen further." He looked like he might argue, then simply nodded. "Be careful. If you're not back by dark, I'll assume you've had trouble and come looking." The warning, or was it reassurance, followed Eleanor as she hurried to her truck, which already wore a thin glaze of fresh ice across its windshield. She scraped it clear with numbed fingers, then carefully navigated through Colmont's nearly empty streets toward the mountain road. The ascent proved even more harrowing than anticipated. Twice the truck's wheels lost traction on icy patches, sending her skidding dangerously close to the road's edge, where only thin air waited below. The temperature gauge dropped steadily as she climbed higher, the late afternoon light already fading from the sky. By the time Eleanor finally reached the cabin, darkness had nearly fallen, and she was shaking from both cold and delayed shock. At the journey's dangers, she hastily unloaded her supplies, made multiple trips through the deepening snow, then collapsed beside the fireplace to begin the laborious process of starting a new fire, with fingers so numb they barely functioned. Warmth gradually returned to the cabin. Eleanor unpacked the journals from her bag, relieved to find them undamaged. She arranged them chronologically on the table, along with Drake's crude map and a modern topographical chart of the area she'd purchased at the general store. If she could correlate Drake's landmarks with current features, she might narrow down the mine's location considerably. Hours passed as she cross-referenced descriptions, taking careful notes on potential sites. The Devil's Tooth, Drake mentioned, appeared to correspond to a distinctive rock formation, now labeled Chimney Rock, on modern maps. The box canyon described in his later entries might be what locals now called Dead End Gorge, a narrow ravine, notorious for flash floods during spring thaws. Most promising of all, Eleanor found a small notation on the modern map indicating Frozen Falls, potentially the ice curtain Drake had described concealing the mine entrance. It lay approximately 5 miles northeast of her cabin, in rugged terrain that would be challenging but not impossible to traverse come spring. The discovery sent a thrill of excitement through her. The mine might actually exist, just as Drake had described. If so, the gold could still be there, untouched for over a century. The Outlaw's buried saddlebags beneath the stone outside were just the beginning, a fraction of the wealth potentially hidden within the mountain itself. Eleanor was so engrossed in her mapping that she almost missed the sound, a faint crunch, of snow outside the cabin, too deliberate to be settling branches or nocturnal wildlife. She froze, listening intently. It came again. Footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. Someone was outside, circling the property in the darkness. Eleanor quickly gathered the journals and map, shoving them beneath a loose floorboard she'd discovered under the sofa earlier. That day, her heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps paused near the front door. She reached for the fireplace poker, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. A soft knock broke the silence, so gentle she might have imagined it. Then another, more insistent. "Eleanor, it's James Harlan. Just checking that you made it safely." The voice was unmistakable, but suspicion kept her silent for a moment longer. Why would the deputy have followed her all the way up the mountain, after she'd declined his assistance? And why approach so stealthily, Eleanor? More concern in his tone now. "If you're in there, please respond. If not, I need to start a search before this cold becomes life-threatening." She moved cautiously to the door, poker still gripped tightly. "I'm here," she called through the wood. "Just startled to have a visitor this late." "Sorry about that. Followed your truck's tracks after you didn't check in by radio. Road's completely iced over now. Barely made it up myself." His voice sounded genuinely apologetic. "Mind if I come in briefly? Cold enough out here to freeze?" Blood solid." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the hidden journals. Everything she'd learned today suggested the Harlan family had their own interest in Drake's gold. Yet refusing him entry would only raise suspicions, especially since he'd apparently come out of legitimate concern for her safety. "Just a moment," she called, quickly scanning the cabin for anything that might reveal her discoveries. Satisfied, nothing remained in view. She unlocked the door. James Harlan stood on her threshold, his tall frame dusted with fresh snow, his face reddened by the bitter cold. "Thank you," he said as she stepped aside to admit him. "Wasn't looking forward to the ride back down without warming up first." He removed his hat and gloves, moving gratefully toward the fire. As the flames illuminated his features, Eleanor noticed a fresh cut above his right eyebrow, already beginning to bruise. "You're hurt," she said, momentarily forgetting her suspicions. Harlan touched the injury, seeming surprised to find blood on his fingertips. "Truck slid on that last curve, clipped a tree branch coming through the window." He shrugged it off. "Hazard of mountain driving in winter." "Let me clean that at least," Eleanor insisted, retrieving the first aid kit she'd purchased that morning. As she dabbed at the cut with an antiseptic wipe, she studied his face more closely. The resemblance to his ancestor, Marshal Robert Harmon, was striking now that she knew to look for it. The same strong jawline, the same watchful blue eyes that missed nothing. "I owe you an apology," Harlan said suddenly. "For what?" "For not being entirely forthcoming about my family's connection to your cabin." He met her gaze directly. My grandfather had an arrangement with your great-uncle. Our family has been watching over that property for generations." Eleanor's hand stilled. "Why?" The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken questions. Harlan seemed to be measuring his words carefully. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Family history, mostly. My great-grandfather was a federal marshal in these territories back in the 1890s. He had a professional interest in the area around this cabin." "Because of Samuel Drake," Eleanor said, watching his reaction closely. Something flickered in Harlan's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she knew the name. "Yes, Drake was wanted for multiple robberies and murders across 3 states. My great-grandfather made it his mission to bring him to justice, because Drake killed his brother." Eleanor applied a butterfly bandage to the cut, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the rapid beating of her heart. She was testing waters, revealing that she knew more than she should if she'd only just arrived. Harlan's posture stiffened slightly. "You've been talking to Ida Wilkins," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She loves sharing local history, especially the more dramatic chapters. She mentioned your family changed their name from Harmon to Harlan. Why was that?" He sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw where stubble had begun to darken. "After Drake disappeared, there were rumors that Robert Harmon had killed him in these mountains and taken the stolen gold for himself. No evidence, of course, but mud sticks. His son, my grandfather, changed the family name when he returned. From the First World War, wanted a fresh start. The explanation made sense, yet Eleanor sensed he was holding something back. And the arrangement with my great-uncle? Morris was obsessed with finding Drake's gold. My grandfather helped with his searches in exchange for hunting rights on the property. When Morris grew too old to visit regularly, he asked our family to keep an eye on the place. It became sort of a tradition." Harlan glanced around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the bookshelf where the journals had been. "I should have explained all this when we first met, but it's not exactly casual conversation. Hello, welcome to your inherited cabin, by the way. My family's been secretly monitoring it for decades." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled at his dry delivery. "No, I suppose that would have been awkward. More than awkward," he admitted. "Especially since I wasn't sure what you knew about the cabin's history." And now, his eyes met hers. "Now I'm fairly certain you know more than you're letting on. Just as I suspect you found something in this cabin that's got you asking questions about Samuel Drake and buried gold." The directness caught Eleanor off guard. Denial would be pointless. Harlan clearly had his own sources of information about the cabin and its secrets. The question was how much to reveal. "I found some old journals," she said carefully. "They mentioned Drake hiding out here after being wounded." Harlan nodded, unsurprised. Morris kept detailed records. He believed Drake spent his final winter in this cabin before dying of his wounds. Eleanor hesitated. Should she mention that the journals belonged to Drake himself, not her great-uncle? That they detailed not just the outlaw's presence, but the specific location of both buried gold and a hidden mine? The information could change everything. Her relationship with Harlan, her standing in Coalmont, possibly her future. "The storm's getting worse," Harlan said, moving to the window and changing the subject. "I shouldn't have followed you up here. Now we're both stuck until it passes." Eleanor joined him at the window. Outside, snow swirled in the darkness, driven horizontally by howling wind. The temperature had plummeted further, evidenced by the crystalline formations spreading across, the glass panes from the edges inward. "You knew the risk when you came after me," she observed. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Yes, but I couldn't not come, knowing what these mountains can do to the unprepared. Morris Whitaker spent 30 years exploring these ridges and still respected their dangers. You've been here 3 days." The concern seemed genuine, but Eleanor remained wary. If Harlan's family had indeed been searching for Drake's gold across generations, her possession of The outlaw's journals made her either a valuable ally or a potential obstacle. "You can take the loft," she said, practicality winning out over suspicion. "I'll sleep down here by the fire." Harlan shook his head. "I'll take the floor. You keep the loft." Neither mentioned the obvious third option, that he could attempt to return to Colmont despite the storm. The unspoken agreement that he would stay the night settled between them, raising new questions about trust and intentions that Eleanor wasn't prepared to answer. While Harlan brought in more firewood from the lean-to outside, Eleanor quickly checked that her hiding place beneath the floorboard remained undisturbed. The journals were secure, their secrets safe for now. She would need to find a better hiding place, perhaps bury them somewhere on the property once the ground thawed. Enough to dig. They worked together in silence, Eleanor heating canned soup on the wood stove, while Harlan built up the fire against the deepening cold. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, the storm's ferocity increasing until the cabin itself seemed to shudder with each gust of wind. "It wasn't just professional for my great-grandfather," Harlan said suddenly, as they sat eating their meager meal by firelight. "The pursuit of Drake, I mean. It was personal." Eleanor waited, sensing he needed to tell the story in his own way. James Harmon, my namesake, was Robert's younger brother. He was a bank teller in Clearwater when Drake's gang hit the place in '98. By all accounts, he was no hero type, just a quiet man who did his job and went home to his wife and daughter every evening. Harlan stared into the flames as if they contained the images of the past. When Drake demanded the safe's contents, James complied. No resistance. But something went wrong. Witnesses said Drake shot him anyway, point blank, then took the money and ran. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. Harlan's jaw tightened. Robert Harmon tracked Drake for over a year after that, followed him across 3 states through some of the harshest territory in the West. When Drake was finally wounded and fled into these mountains in the winter of 1899, Robert was right behind him. "But he never caught him," Eleanor prompted when Harlan fell silent. "That's the official story." Something in his tone suggested otherwise. No body was ever found, no actual proof of what happened to Drake. Some said he escaped with the gold. Others believed he died from his wounds, his remains scattered by scavengers or buried in some unmarked grave. "And what does your family believe?" Harlan's gaze shifted from the fire to her face, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My grandfather believed Robert Harmon found Drake in this cabin, already dying. That he recovered some of the stolen money, but Drake had hidden most of it somewhere in these mountains. That Robert spent the rest of his life searching for it, just as Morris Whitaker did later. And you? What do you believe?" "I believe these mountains hold secrets worth keeping," he said carefully, "and others worth finding, depending on who's doing the searching and why." The answer was diplomatic, yet cryptic. Eleanor wondered how much Harlan knew about the mine described in Drake's journals, or if his family's search had focused solely on the money buried on the property. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" Harlan asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Really, this cabin, these mountains, they're not exactly a logical choice for starting over, especially for someone from the East with no experience in this kind of isolation." The question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Harlan was observant, trained to notice inconsistencies in people's stories. "I told you the truth before," she said. "After Michael died, I lost everything to medical bills and bank loans. This cabin was my only option, but you could have sold it," he pointed out. "Even with its condition and remote location, the land itself has value. Timber rights alone would have given you a fresh start somewhere more hospitable." Eleanor hadn't considered that possibility, an oversight that now seemed glaring. Of course, the property had value beyond the dilapidated cabin. Why hadn't the lawyer handling Morris's estate mentioned that option? "I didn't know," she admitted. "The attorney just said I'd inherited a cabin in Colorado. Given my situation, any shelter seemed better than none. Harlan studied her face, apparently satisfied with her sincerity. Convenient for Morris's estate. Administrators. They've been trying to sell that timber for years, but your great-uncle's will specifically prohibited it. When he died, they needed a family member to take possession before they could move forward. So they found me, Eleanor said slowly, the desperate relative no one else cared about, assuming I'd either sell quickly or abandon the property altogether. Likely, though they didn't count on you finding something that would make you want to stay. His gaze was penetrating. Did you find something worth staying for? It was the perfect opening to mention Drake's journals, to share the information about the buried gold and hidden mine. Harlan clearly suspected she had discovered something significant. His family history with Drake gave him legitimate interest in whatever secrets the cabin held, yet something held her back. Caution born from months of watching fair-weather friends disappear when Michael's illness consumed their savings, when creditors began calling, when their comfortable life crumbled. Piece by piece, I found peace, she said instead. Something I haven't had since Michael got sick. Disappointment flickered briefly across Harlan's features before he masked it. Peace has value too, he acknowledged, though it's an expensive commodity in these mountains during winter. The conversation lulled, both of them retreating into their own thoughts as the storm raged outside. Eleanor added another log to the fire, watching sparks spiral up the chimney. If Drake's journals were accurate, the outlaw had sat in this same spot over a century ago, planning how to retrieve his hidden fortune when spring arrived. Had he succeeded, or had death claimed him before he could reclaim his bloody prize? You should get some rest, Harlan said eventually. Tomorrow will be challenging if this storm continues. Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. The emotional and physical demands of the day had drained her completely. Still, she hesitated, uneasy about sleeping while Harlan remained awake in the cabin. He seemed to read her thoughts. I promised to stay right here by the fire, he said, spreading the blankets she'd provided on the floor nearby. Marshall's honor, despite her lingering doubts, fatigue won out. Eleanor climbed to the loft, settling into the narrow bed with her clothes still on against the cold. Below, she could hear Harlan adding wood to the fire, his movements deliberately quiet to avoid disturbing her. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cabin's unfamiliar noises and dreams where she wandered endless mine tunnels following the ghostly figure of Samuel Drake, who always remained just beyond her reach. When she finally fell into deeper sleep, it was to the rhythmic sound of the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire below. She woke abruptly, unsure what had disturbed her. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of embers from the dying fire. Outside, the storm's fury had diminished to a gentle snowfall. Eleanor lay still, listening. There, the sound that had woken her. A soft scraping like wood against wood, coming from the main room below. Moving silently, Eleanor crept to the edge of the loft and peered over. In the dim light, she could make out Harlan's form crouched near the sofa, his hands working at something on the floor. With horrified certainty, she knew he had discovered her hiding place. The floorboard creaked as she shifted her weight, freezing Harlan in place. He looked up, catching her watching him, Drake's journal clearly visible in his hands. I can explain, he said softly, but Eleanor was already scrambling down the ladder, heart pounding with betrayal and fear. How did you find them? She demanded, reaching the bottom rung and confronting him across the dimly lit room. Harlan held the journal carefully, almost reverently. This cabin has been in my family's care for generations, he said. Did you think I wouldn't know its secrets? Every loose board, every hidden space. He gestured to the other journals laid out beside him. These aren't Morris Whitaker's records. They're Samuel Drake's personal journals, aren't they? The direct question left no room for evasion. Yes, Eleanor admitted, watching him warily. I found them my first day here, And you didn't think to mention this when I asked directly what you'd discovered? There was no accusation in his tone, just weary understanding. Would you have? In my position, she countered, a stranger with an admitted family vendetta against Drake shows up at my door, clearly looking for something. Then I find journals that might lead to a fortune in stolen gold. What would you have done? Fair point, Harlan conceded. He carefully closed the journal he was holding. I wouldn't have trusted me either. Eleanor moved closer, torn between anger at his violation of her privacy and curiosity about what he'd learned. You read them. What did you find? Enough to know Drake really was here, just as my family always believed. Harlan's expression was complex, satisfaction mingled with something darker. He writes about the gold, about hiding it. Did you find the map? Harlan shook his head. No map in these pages. Eleanor hesitated, then retrieved the folded paper from beneath the loose board where she'd hidden it separately from the journals. He drew this, she said, carefully unfolding the yellow document. It shows the route to the mine from something called Devil's Tooth. Harlan examined the crude map with evident fascination. Devil's Tooth is what they used to call Chimney Rock, he said. It's about 3 miles northeast of here, and this, he pointed to the circled X marking the mine's location, must be in Dead End Gorge. The geography matches. You know the area well, Eleanor observed. I've spent my life in these mountains, he replied without looking up. Every summer since I was old enough to walk, my father would take me hiking through these ridges, always searching, always looking, for signs of Drake's passage or the gold he supposedly hid. Did you ever find anything? Harlan's gaze lifted to meet hers. Old campfire remains that might have been from any hunter. A rusted cartridge case of the same caliber Drake favored. Nothing conclusive. His fingers traced the path marked on the map. Nothing like this. The intimate way he handled the document reminded Eleanor that this wasn't merely historical curiosity for him. Drake had murdered his ancestor. The Outlaw's journals represented both valuable information and a painful family legacy. What happens now? She asked quietly. Harlan carefully refolded the map. That depends on you. These journals legally belong to you as Morris's heir. The information they contain... He paused, considering his words. Well, that's more complicated. Because of the gold? Because of what it represents. Harlan ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the dark strands shot with silver. To me, it's about justice long delayed. To others, it would be nothing but dollar signs. If word gets out about these journals, about the map, you'll have treasure hunters tearing up these mountains within days and destroying any chance of finding the truth, Eleanor concluded. The realization brought clarity to her jumbled thoughts. The journals weren't just a potential treasure map. They were historical documents that could finally reveal what had happened to Samuel Drake and the stolen gold that had claimed so many lives, directly and indirectly. The snow's letting up, Harlan said, glancing toward the window where dawn had begun to lighten the eastern sky. If the temperature rises enough, the roads might be passable by afternoon. You're leaving? She couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Unless you want me to stay? He began gathering the journals, stacking them neatly on the table, rather than returning them to their hiding place. These are yours, Eleanor. Whatever you decide to do with them, with the information they contain, that's your choice. But I'd like to make a proposal. What kind of proposal? A partnership. Harlan met her gaze directly. Spring is still months away. The mine entrance will be buried in snow and ice until at least April. Even Drake had to wait out the winter before retrieving his gold. That gives us time to study these journals properly, to understand exactly what we're looking for and where. Come spring, we search together, and the gold, if we find it, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. His expression softened slightly. But I'm not interested in personal enrichment from blood money. Whatever we find, It needs to be properly documented, the historical record set straight. After that, he shrugged. I'm more interested in closing my family's chapter with Samuel Drake than in getting rich. The offer seemed reasonable, even generous, given the circumstances. Harlan's knowledge of the mountains would be invaluable when the time came to search. For the mine, his family connection to the Drake saga gave him legitimate interest in its resolution. And if Eleanor was honest with herself, the prospect of facing the winter alone in this isolated cabin had become more daunting with each passing day. "Partners," she said, extending her hand. "But no more searching through my things while I sleep." Smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he took her hand. "Agreed, though in my defense, I was checking the floor for drafts when I noticed the loose board." "A likely story, Deputy," but there was no real anger in her tone. Something had shifted between them, a tentative trust building on the foundation of shared secrets. Outside, the first rays of morning sun glinted off the fresh snow, transforming Devil's Ridge into a glittering wonderland that hid its dangers beneath beauty. Somewhere beneath that pristine blanket lay answers to questions that had haunted two families for generations, and possibly enough gold to change both their lives forever. The following weeks settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Eleanor and Harlan divided their time between practical survival tasks and meticulous study of Drake's journals, searching for any overlooked details about the mine's location or the fate of the outlaw himself. Harlan made the treacherous journey between Colmont and the cabin every few days, bringing supplies and news from town. The winter had deepened its grip on the mountains, with temperatures rarely rising above freezing and additional storms adding to the already substantial snowpack. Without Harlan's help and mountain expertise, Eleanor knew she would have struggled to survive her first Colorado winter. Today marked 3 weeks since their partnership began. Outside, fat snowflakes drifted lazily through the clear mountain air, accumulating on branches already bent under their white burden. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Eleanor had scrubbed every surface, repaired smaller leaks in the roof, and arranged her meager possessions to create a space that, while still rudimentary, felt increasingly like home. "Found something," Harlan announced, looking up from the second journal where Drake had documented his recovery from his wounds. He sat at the oak table, various maps spread before him alongside the outlaw's writings. Eleanor paused in her task of organizing the kitchen shelves to join him. "What is it?" "An inconsistency I haven't noticed before." He pointed to an entry dated January 15th, 1900. "Here, Drake mentions taking a full day's journey to check on the mine entrance after a heavy snow, returning to the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks." "That suggests the mine is farther than we thought," Eleanor observed, leaning over his shoulder. "Exactly. In these conditions, a full day's journey, even for someone familiar with the terrain, couldn't be more than 7 or 8 miles round trip." Harlan traced a circle on the topographical map with his finger. "That puts the mine entrance somewhere in this area, not near Dead End Gorge where we initially thought." Eleanor studied the region he indicated, a section of particularly rugged terrain, marked by tightly clustered contour lines indicating steep slopes. Could Frozen Falls still be the landmark Drake mentioned? The ice curtain behind which the entrance is hidden? Possibly. Harlan consulted another map, this one showing water features. There are several seasonal waterfalls in that area, any of which could freeze during winter. Without Drake's exact description of the approach, it's difficult to narrow down further. He sighed in frustration. If only the map he drew had been more detailed. He was deliberately vague, Eleanor reminded him. Drake didn't want anyone else finding his gold if the journals fell into the wrong hands. Harlan nodded, his expression pensive. My great-grandfather must have come tantalizingly close during his searches. All those years, and the answers were hidden right here in this cabin. Eleanor heard the note of regret in his voice. Your family never gave up, though. That persistence is why we have the chance to solve this mystery now. He glanced up at her, a hint of warmth replacing the regret in his blue eyes. True enough. And speaking of persistence, I managed to track down some information on your great-uncle's estate administrators while I was in town yesterday. This caught Eleanor's attention, since learning from Harlan that her inheritance might have been manipulated, she'd wondered about the law firm's motives in directing her to the seemingly worthless cabin. What did you find out? The firm that handled Morris's estate, Ridgway and Partners, also represents Mountain Valley Timber, which has been trying to acquire logging rights to this property for years. Specifically, they're interested in the old-growth forest on the north slope, the same area where Drake supposedly buried his saddlebags, Eleanor noted. Exactly. If those trees were harvested, any evidence of Drake's cache would likely be destroyed. During the logging operation, the implications troubled Eleanor, so my arrival complicated their plans. They probably expected me to sell quickly out of necessity, or simply abandon the property when I saw its condition. That would be my guess. Harlan leaned back in his chair. I've asked a friend in the county assessor's office to look into the ownership structure of Mountain Valley Timber. There might be connections worth exploring. Eleanor appreciated his thoroughness. Harlan had proven himself a valuable ally, not just in their search for Drake's gold, but in navigating the complexities of local politics and property issues she would never have understood on her own. Yet sometimes she caught him watching her, with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, as if he were still trying to decide whether to fully trust her or perhaps wrestling with his own motivations regarding the outlaw's treasure. The town meeting's tonight, he said, changing the subject. Mayor's called it to discuss the spring festival plans. Good opportunity to meet more locals if you're interested in joining me. I'd like that, Eleanor replied. She had ventured into Colmont several times since that first visit, gradually becoming a familiar face to the townspeople. Most had been welcoming, though she sensed an undercurrent of curiosity about her presence that occasionally bordered on suspicion. Some clearly wondered why anyone would willingly inhabit the isolated cabin, especially a woman alone. Of course, she wasn't truly alone anymore. Holland's frequent presence had undoubtedly been noted and discussed. Small towns thrived on such observations, weaving narratives from fragments of fact and generous portions of speculation. Eleanor wondered what story Colmont was telling itself. About the widow and the deputy. I should warn you, Holland said, as if reading her thoughts. People are talking about us. I'm not surprised. Eleanor returned to the kitchen shelves, organizing canned goods by type, a small attempt at imposing order in her uncertain new life. I imagine it's quite the scandal. The city widow and the local lawman spending so much time together in an isolated cabin. A smile tugged at Harlan's mouth. Ida Wilkins has apparently appointed herself our official matchmaker. She cornered me outside the general store yesterday to enumerate your virtues and remind me that I'm not getting any younger. Eleanor laughed, despite herself. That sounds like Ida. She tried something similar when I was in town last week, though she focused more on your apparently extensive property holdings and good standing in the community. All true, of course, he said with mock seriousness, though she neglected to mention my scintillating conversational skills and exceptional taste in literature, clearly an oversight on her part. Eleanor matched his light tone, appreciating the moment of levity. Such moments had become more frequent as they grew comfortable with each other, their initial wariness giving way to something approaching, friendship. We should go soon if we want to reach town before dark, Harlan said, glancing at his watch. The last section of road was still icy this morning. While Harlan gathered the journals and maps, securing them in their newest hiding place, compartment they'd discovered behind a loose stone in the fireplace, Eleanor prepared for the trip to town. She had learned to layer clothing effectively against the cold, to wrap her lower face against wind that could freeze exposed skin within minutes, to move deliberately through deep snow to conserve energy. The journey down the mountain passed. Without incident, Harlan's sturdy four-wheel drive vehicle handling the treacherous conditions with reassuring competence. As they approached Colmont, Eleanor noted Christmas decorations adorning many of the buildings, strings of colored lights, wreaths on doors, even a large tree erected in the town square. The holiday was just 2 weeks away, a fact she'd nearly forgotten in her focus on survival and Drake's journals. The festival they're discussing tonight is the Christmas Bazaar, Harlan explained as they parked near the community center. It's been a tradition here for over 70 years. Local artisans sell crafts, there's food, music, the school kids perform. It's the highlight of the winter for most folks. Sounds lovely, Eleanor said, genuinely warming to the idea of participating in a community tradition. When is it held? Weekend. Before Christmas, weather permitting. Some years it's had to be postponed due to storms, but rarely cancelled entirely. He helped her navigate a particularly icy patch of sidewalk. Your great-uncle Morris used to attend religiously. Had a standing order for Maggie Turner's apple butter and Ruth Carson's quilts. The community center bustled with activity when they arrived, nearly the entire adult population of Colmont packed into the modest space. Conversation hummed at a cheerful volume, punctuated by laughter and the occasional raised voice of greeting. Eleanor removed her heavy coat, immediately spotted by Ida Wilkins, who waved enthusiastically from across the room. "There you are, dear." The elderly woman made her way through the crowd with surprising agility. "I was just telling Marion Jenkins. You'd likely make it down for the meeting. She's eager to meet you, been quilting for 40 years and never met anyone from Philadelphia." Before Eleanor could respond, Ida had linked arms with her and was steering her toward a group of women clustered near the refreshment table, effectively separating her from Harlan with the practiced ease of a seasoned social engineer. Looking back over her shoulder, Eleanor caught Harlan's amused expression as he was similarly corralled by several men toward another conversation group. For the next half hour, Eleanor was introduced to what seemed like half the town fielding questions about her background, her adjustment to mountain life, and, with increasing frequency, her relationship with young James Harlan. She deflected these inquiries with good humor, gradually relaxing into the genuine warmth of the community's welcome. When Mayor Collins finally called the meeting to order, Eleanor found herself seated between Ida and a pleasant woman named Sarah Morley, whose husband owned the general store. Harlan had been positioned across the room, though he caught her eye occasionally with subtle glances that suggested he was equally aware of the town's transparent matchmaking efforts. The meeting proceeded efficiently, with discussions about the bazaar's organization, volunteer assignments, and logistics dominating the agenda. Eleanor found herself volunteering to help with decorations, a task that would involve several afternoons working alongside other community members. The commitment felt significant, a step toward belonging rather than merely surviving in her new home. As the formal meeting concluded and residents broke into smaller discussion groups, Eleanor noticed a man she hadn't seen before enter the community center. Tall and expensively dressed in a manner that marked him as an outsider, he surveyed the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. When his gaze landed on her, he smiled and began making his way through the crowd. In her direction. "Eleanor Caldwell?" he asked, extending his hand. "Richard Danforth, Mountain Valley Timber. I've been hoping to meet you." The introduction immediately raised her guard. This was the company Harlan had mentioned, the one trying to acquire logging rights to her property, potentially destroying any evidence of Drake's buried gold in the process. "Mr. Danforth," she acknowledged, accepting his handshake briefly. "What brings you to Colmont?" "Business, primarily. We have interests throughout the region." His smile remained fixed, professionally charming. "But when I heard Morris Whitaker's heir had taken up residence in the old cabin, I wanted to introduce myself personally. Your property represents a significant old-growth timber resource." "I wasn't aware my property was considered a resource by anyone," Eleanor replied coolly. Danforth chuckled as if she'd made a clever joke. "Everything's a resource, if you look at it correctly, Mrs. Caldwell. Those acres of untouched forest represent jobs, economic development, opportunities for a community that's been struggling for decades." He glanced around the room, lowering his voice slightly. "I understand your situation may be financially challenging. I'd like to discuss an arrangement that could benefit us both substantially." Before Eleanor could respond, Harlan appeared at her side, his expression neutral, but his body language decidedly protective. "Evening, Danforth. Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Deputy Harlan," Danforth acknowledged, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Always a pleasure. I was just introducing myself to Mrs. Caldwell and suggesting we might discuss business opportunities regarding her property." "Interesting timing," Harlan observed, "considering Mrs. Caldwell only recently took possession." The tension between the two men was palpable. Eleanor sensed a history she wasn't privy to, an antagonism that extended beyond their current interaction. "Merely being proactive," Danforth replied smoothly. He produced a business card, offering it to Eleanor. "When you're ready to discuss the significant value of your timber assets, please call. My company is prepared to make a very generous offer, one that would allow you to relocate somewhere more comfortable than that rustic cabin." Eleanor accepted the card without comment, noting the embossed gold lettering and expensive cardstock. Everything about Richard Danforth spoke of wealth and influence: his tailored clothing, his manicured appearance, his practiced confidence. He represented a world she had once been adjacent to through Michael's banking career, a world of transactions and assets rather than history and connection. "Thank you for the introduction," she said neutrally. "I'm still getting acquainted with my property, but I'll keep your interest in mind." Danforth nodded, apparently satisfied with even this non-committal response. "That's all I ask. Enjoy the festival planning." With a final, meaningful glance at Harlan, he moved away to speak with Mayor Collins. "Well, that was interesting timing," Eleanor murmured, once Danforth was out of earshot. "Very," Harlan agreed, his expression troubled. "Danforth rarely attends a town functions unless there's something specific he wants. The fact that he approached you so directly suggests he's growing impatient about your property." As snow began falling once more, blanketing the surrounding wilderness in fresh white, Eleanor opened Drake's first journal and continued reading by lantern light, searching for any clue they might have overlooked. The outlaw's words seemed to take on new urgency in the aftermath of the break-in, as if he were speaking directly to her across the century that separated them. "The gold waits for those with patience and courage to claim it. Others have died seeking it, their bones now part of the mountain's foundation. Such is the price of avarice. Yet I persist, for what else remains to me but this final prize? When spring comes, I shall retrieve my fortune or join those who failed before me, either way finding resolution to this long pursuit." The storm finally broke at dawn, revealing a transformed world of pristine white. Eleanor and Harlan stood at the edge of the ridge, gazing down at the box canyon where Drake's map had led them after months of searching. The spring thaw had finally revealed what winter had concealed, 3 standing stones forming a gateway, just as Drake had described. "Ready?" Harlan asked, offering his hand. Eleanor took it, feeling the strength of their partnership that had evolved through a winter of shared danger, midnight research sessions, and narrowly escaping Danforth's increasingly desperate attempts to acquire her property. "Ready," she confirmed. Together they descended the path, following the ghost of Samuel Drake to the frozen waterfall that had guarded his secret for over a century. Behind its crystalline curtain, just as the outlaw had written, the mountain revealed its treasure, not just gold, but the final pages of Drake's story. The mine contained more than the stolen Union Pacific fortune. It held Drake's confession, his redemption, and the surprising truth. He hadn't died an outlaw, but had lived out his days as Coalmont's first mayor under a new identity, using portions of the gold to build the town that Eleanor now called home. The discovery rewrote history, brought justice to Harlan's family, and secured Eleanor's future. She established the Drake-Whitaker Historical Foundation, preserving both the gold's legacy and the pristine forest Danforth had coveted. "Sometimes," Eleanor told the documentary crew filming in her renovated cabin, "the most valuable treasures aren't what we initially seek, but what we discover along the way." She smiled at Harlan, now her husband, as he added another log to the fire in the hearth where they'd first found Drake's journals. "If this story of redemption, hidden treasure, and unexpected new beginnings touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true historical mysteries. Tomorrow we'll reveal the shocking truth behind the vanished stagecoach of Silver Creek. You won't want to miss it." "Or someone told him I'd be here tonight," Eleanor speculated. "Is he trustworthy?" Harlan considered the question carefully. "Mountain Valley Timber employs a lot of people in the region. They've generally operated within legal boundaries, though. They push right up against environmental regulations when they can. Danforth himself." He paused, choosing his words. "Let's just say his interests always come first, and he has significant political connections at the county and state level." The warning was clear. Danforth was not someone to underestimate or casually dismiss, regardless of Eleanor's lack of interest in selling her timber rights. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mayor Collins called, waving her over to his conversation group. "Come meet our festival committee. We need your Philadelphia perspective on our humble decorations." The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly enough, though Eleanor remained aware of Danforth's presence as he circulated through the crowd, engaging various residents in conversation. She noticed he spoke at length with several members of the town council, his manner persuasive, their responses attentive. Whatever his purpose in Coalmont extended beyond his interest in her property. When the meeting finally concluded, Eleanor and Harlan stepped out into the cold night air, stars glittering with exceptional clarity in the mountain sky. The temperature had dropped further during the evening, their breath forming clouds of vapor with each exhalation. "Danforth showing unusual interest in your property," Harlan said as they walked toward his vehicle. "The timing feels significant, especially given what we've discovered about the estate administration. You think he knows about the journals, about Drake's gold?" The possibility sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the frigid air. "I think it's a remarkable coincidence that Mountain Valley Timber has pursued that specific parcel for years, focusing on the exact area where Drake allegedly buried his saddlebags." Harlan unlocked the truck, holding the door for her. "And I don't believe in remarkable coincidences." As they drove back toward Devil's Ridge, Eleanor considered the implications. If Danforth or someone connected to him knew about Drake's journals, knew what they contained, the pressure to acquire her property would only increase. The gold Drake had buried, supposedly worth a fortune even by 1900 standards, would be worth millions today, far more than the timber rights Danforth officially sought. "We need to move forward with locating the mine," she said finally. "If others are searching or suspect what we know, we can't afford to wait until spring." Harlan glanced at her, surprised. "The terrain is extremely dangerous in these conditions." Drake himself waited for spring, Drake wasn't being pursued by a timber company with political connections and unknown motives, Eleanor pointed out. We need to at least try to find the stone where he buried the saddlebags. That location is on the property already, accessible even in winter. Harlan fell silent, considering her words as the truck climbed the winding road back to the cabin. Finally, he nodded. We can attempt to locate the saddlebags. If Danforth is after the timber rights as a cover for searching for Drake's gold, finding even that portion would strengthen your position legally. A new sense of urgency infused their partnership as they returned to the cabin. The encounter with Danforth had transformed their historical research project into something more immediate. They were no longer simply following a century-old mystery at their leisure. They were potentially in a race against opponents with greater resources and uncertain scruples. As the truck's headlights illuminated the snow-covered clearing around the cabin, Eleanor noticed something amiss. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible where it should have been securely closed. "We locked it when we left," she said, alarm spreading through her. "I'm certain of it." Harlan immediately tensed, cutting the engine and lights. "Stay here," he instructed, reaching beneath his seat for a flashlight and his service weapon. "Lock the doors. I'm coming with you," Eleanor insisted, already opening her door. "If someone's been searching for the journals, exactly why you should stay put. We don't know who's out there or what they want." But even as he spoke, Harlan recognized the determination in her expression. "Fine, but stay behind me. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." They approached the cabin cautiously, moving through snow that muffled their footsteps. Harlan held his flashlight in his left hand, his right resting on his holstered weapon, ready to draw if necessary. At the door he paused, listening for any sounds from within. Hearing nothing, he pushed the door fully open with his foot, sweeping the flashlight beam through the darkness beyond. The cabin's interior had been thoroughly searched. Furniture was overturned, contents of drawers spilled across the floor. Even the mattress from the loft had been thrown down and slashed open. Whoever had done this had been looking for something specific and hadn't been concerned about hiding their intrusion. "The journals," Eleanor whispered, immediately moving toward the fireplace. Harlan caught her arm. "Let me check the rest of the building first." A quick but thorough inspection confirmed they were alone. The intruder had completed their search and departed. Only then did they approach the fireplace, where Eleanor quickly examined the hidden compartment behind the loose stone. "They're still here," she said with relief, withdrawing the leather-bound volumes from their hiding place. "They didn't find them." Harlan surveyed the destruction with a professional eye. This wasn't kids or ordinary vandals. This was a deliberate search by someone who knew what they were looking for. "Danforth?" Eleanor asked, clutching the journals protectively. "Possibly, though it seems risky for him personally. More likely, someone working for him." Harlan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "The timing is too perfect to be coincidental, keeping us in town while someone searched the cabin." Eleanor sank onto the one chair that remained upright, the reality of their situation settling heavily upon her. "We're not safe here anymore, are we?" "No," Harlan admitted. "Not with the journals. They're too valuable, too dangerous." He began, righting furniture, his movements precise and controlled despite his evident anger. "We need to secure them somewhere else, somewhere no one would think to look." "Where? I don't have anywhere else." Harlan paused in his efforts to restore order, his expression resolute. "I do. My grandfather's hunting cabin, deeper in the mountains. No road access, completely off-grid. Few people even know it exists anymore." "When can we go?" "First light tomorrow." "It's too dangerous to attempt the trail in darkness." He gestured around the ransacked cabin. "Tonight, we'll put this place back in order and keep the journals with us at all times. Whoever did this might return when they realize their search." Came up empty. As they worked to restore the cabin, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. The intrusion had crystallized something that had been forming in her mind since discovering Drake's journals. These mountains, this cabin, the secrets it contained, they had given her purpose when she had none, direction when she had been adrift. She would not surrender them easily, not to Danforth or anyone else who thought her desperation made her vulnerable. Samuel Drake had once found refuge in these same walls, plotting the retrieval of his ill-gotten fortune while forces gathered against him. Now Eleanor would follow his example, using the outlaw's own words to uncover the truth he had hidden in these mountains. The stakes had risen dramatically, but so had her determination. By midnight, they had restored reasonable order to the cabin, though the slashed mattress and broken items could not be quickly repaired. Eleanor insisted on taking the first watch while Harlan rested, positioning herself near the window with Drake's journals close at hand and Harlan's spare revolver within reach. Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying the promise of another approaching storm.